My very first public talk on the subject of open source was in 1997, and it was called Hardware, Software, and Infoware. And it was about an idea which at the time was not as widely understood as it is today. But it was the idea that the internet was the next great application platform. And interestingly, I gave that talk at the same conference where Eric Raymond first gave his seminal talk about open source, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. It was the Linux Congress in Würzburg, Germany. And my talk was not as well received as his was. He really electrified the world with his talk about open source. It took quite a lot longer for what I was talking about to sink in. What I started with was a story that came to me from a friend who had bought her first computer so she could use Amazon. And it reminded me of the days when people bought computers because they wanted to use VisiCalc and that whole idea of a killer app. And I became fixated on this idea that the web was bringing us this new generation of killer apps, but they were different from the apps that had come before. And I spent the next, 7 or 8 years trying to articulate what that difference was in a series of talks and models and different ways of explaining it. And the first thing that I came to was the idea that web apps were made up in many ways of information with little bits of action embedded in them. If you think about a web application like Amazon, it's lots of information with little bits of action, a button, a link that you click on that does something, versus the old kind of software that was, lots and lots of program with little bits of information embedded in it. So there's a little menu that tells you something. And that was my initial definition of what was different. But before long, I realized that that was nowhere near profound enough. And somewhere around there, I started the Perl conference, which was really the predecessor for this conference. And I was trying to understand just how central Perl was to the web and why it was so important. And I came at the whole question of open source from a very different place than all the people who were thinking a lot about Linux. I was thinking about the internet. And I was thinking about that wonderful line of Hassan Schroeder's from 1993 or so, Perl is the duct tape of the internet. And so I was writing a paper about why Perl was important, and I was going around talking to all my authors. And my next big breakthrough was in a conversation with Jeff Friedel, who was the author of our book, Mastering Regular Expressions. Now, Jeff told me a story of what he did all day at Yahoo. He said, I write regular expressions to match up news stories to ticker symbols for finance.yahoo.com. And I thought, wow. That's really interesting. That's telling me something else about how this next generation of software is different. The programmer is still inside. Jeff has to do stuff every day to keep up with this flood of information. And I thought, oh, yeah, Amazon's like that too. And a few years later, Google is like that too. That the programmer is still inside the application, tuning it, working on it, rebuilding it. And that was why scripting languages like Perl and Python were so important, because you're just like we have, probably have some duct tape on the floor somewhere here, covering up the wires or whatever. It's not going to be here tomorrow. It's going to keep changing. And that was the meaning of that Perl is the duct tape of the internet line. And I kind of continued to work that model that people were inside these web apps as well as software code. But I also realized then the next big breakthrough I had was this idea that Simon mentioned, that there were some really powerful analogies between what happened with the IBM PC in hardware and what was happening with open source software and the open standards of the internet. And that was that the old business models were becoming commoditized. And the value was disappearing from an area that had been hugely valuable. But that didn't mean that value was going out of the ecosystem. It meant that something else was becoming valuable. And so, for example, in the early days of the computer industry, hardware was where all the value was locked up, and software was this kind of extra thing. And, the big companies were hardware companies. But once the PC became a commodity, all the margins went out of software. It became a lot harder to make money there. And this company that IBM didn't even think was worth paying too much attention to became hugely powerful because all of a sudden software was the new locus of power. And I thought, what's going to happen here is everybody's still going to be chasing software and building, quote, software companies, in this era of open source, and they'll be trying to make the software a little bit proprietary, a little bit less open. We saw that in hardware. And meanwhile, somebody else is going to figure out what that new locus of value is. And so I spent the next few years thinking about what is that next locus of value? Where is it going to move to? And that's where I kind of came around with my framing about Web 2.0. And the idea was that it was actually data that was going to become hugely valuable in that era, that was going to be the location of the outsized profits. Now you start putting all those ideas together and you start to understand why Google, for example, became such a powerhouse, because they were a company that was about amassing huge amounts of data, figuring out what to do with it and turning it directly into services, a whole new set of business models, in this case rooted in advertising, but drawing on the shift from again, that I had written about in 1997, hardware, software, Infoware. Google understood Infoware much more deeply than I did in 1997. They just went out and built it. They realized that it was massive amounts of data processed algorithmically to deliver services in real time. And of course, that movement has continued. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because when we think about cloud computing, it's really easy to get caught in the parts that are familiar to us from the old days. We get to have a virtual machine, and it kind of looks like having a local machine, except it's just sort of somewhere up there in the cloud. Or maybe we get to have an application, and it's shared in some interesting ways, but it's still kind of like the applications that we're used to. But I want to just make sure that as you think about the future, you think about the kinds of applications that could only happen today, that are driven by massive amounts of data in the cloud, real-time processing of that data, and the delivery of services. This is the stuff that's way up in the stack. But being able to corral all the kind of data assets, all of the kinds of capabilities to deliver those kinds of applications is the great challenge. And in an open source context, the great challenge is to make sure that those assets are not owned and controlled by a single company, but instead that they come from multiple sources that work together in the way the internet has always worked. So to take a really almost canonical example of one of these kinds of applications, if you take out your phone, whether it's an iPhone or an Android phone, and you think about the kinds of capabilities that are displayed by something like turn-by-turn directions on this phone. And particularly Google has put together an enormous set of data assets where I can speak into this phone and speech recognition happens in the cloud. And the phone already is reporting where I am, so I can say, get me from where I am to somewhere else. And it can give me directions, and it tracks me. I see my little arrow there as I'm walking on my walking route, and it shows me that I'm halfway to my destination. That's an enormous change from what we were imagining 10 years ago. And that is the future of cloud apps. Massive amounts of data that nobody is looking at, but the machines are processing and delivering to us just what we need right when we need it, with machine learning algorithms helping sort through and make things happen. And I look at this and I go, there's a choice of futures for us in the cloud. And one is that somebody wins. Somebody assembles enough of those assets that they are the platform of the future. Whether it's Google or Apple or Microsoft or someone we don't even know yet. Or we have this other future, and that's the one that I've been trying to encourage people to think about, to fight for. And that is a world in which we say, Facebook is a pretty good identity subsystem. And wow, there's these great open, low-level, sort of data storage subsystems that we can get at through these cloud providers. And over here, these guys have good location services. And guess what? They all just work together in the way that a Linux distribution works together. You don't have to actually get all the pieces from the same people. And that's the cloud future I want to see you guys working to make happen, where everything is interoperable. It doesn't all have to come from one provider in order to work. It works because we've designed a system where the pieces fit together even though they don't come from one source. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in this panel, and hopefully that will be part of whatever we're going to talk about next year. All right.